And now there is no institution that doesn't, at least in some way, show its adherence to cultural Marxist ideology. Green and woke are inextricable. For a technocracy to be created, they need to take full control of population and resources. Revolutionaries don't stop. The revolution will keep going until it meets sufficient resistance. They want to have a pretty radical depopulation.
Hello there, and welcome to a special episode of the Resistance Podcast, here with Dr Niall McCrae from, would you like to say where we are?
Well, we're here at the Hope Music Festival near Battle in Sussex.
And how are you finding it?
Well, I've only just come up today, and lucky I wasn't here yesterday because it was a bit wet yesterday, wasn't it? A bit muddy. But the sun's out today, and I've just done a talk on my research on the climate crisis scam. Can I say that?
Yes.
Which seemed to go down very well, and everyone's in a good mood. And I'm looking forward to listening to the live bands and the DJ later.
So do you want to give us a little background on who you are and what your acumen is? Because you used to work at university, didn't you?
So I worked at King's College London for nearly 20 years. And over the time that I was there, I saw just how much this prestigious institution was being taken over by the twin ideologies of green and woke, and that this wasn't really for the benefit of raising the educational, intellectual capacities of our students, but it's about imposing an ideology which serves not the ordinary people at all, but it serves a masterclass who are trying to create a two-tier society. And what they're basically doing with this indoctrination of green and woke ideology is they're just making these young students, they're foot soldiers. The young people themselves are not necessarily going to benefit from this. In fact, they're being taught to support things which are actually against their best interests, taking away freedoms, taking away much of their prospects, that they should have living in a civic democracy. But all of that is going because what we now have is the imposition of a technocracy, which is basically an elite class which will wield total control of population and resources using the tremendous advances in digital technology.
And when was it you first started to notice this?
So I was caught onto the woke thing quite early because I just didn't agree with the idea that some students should be treated favorably because they're members of particularly favored groups. I saw that students were being taught or were being brought up in a culture which was going against Enlightenment values. And, I would see the three principal Enlightenment values being freedom of speech, democracy, and equality before the law. Our students were not interested in that. And after the EU referendum, I heard students say that, we shouldn't have democracy because all these thick people are voting the wrong way. I've heard students say we mustn't have free speech because that means you're allowing this thing called hate speech. And we shouldn't have equality before the law because some groups are discriminated against, and therefore we need to positively discriminate in their favor. So the woke thing I was immersed in, working in a university environment, you can't escape from it. But it started to get more and more in your face. You could kind of ignore the messages on the intranet, but gradually the woke regime became harder and harder to escape from. They started imposing mandatory training about what did they call it? Something about how you would look at people in terms of race and ethnicity and any sort of identity politics status first and foremost, not to see them as an individual, but to see them first and foremost in terms of their status in identity politics. And the green thing, that started to come in heavy when we started to see the Extinction Rebellion protests in London, where they were like blocking roads. And I worked at the Waterloo campus of King's College London, and my office looked out onto Waterloo Bridge, where for a week in, I think it's 2019 or 2018, for a whole week, the Metropolitan Police and the authorities allowed the Extinction Rebellion to close off Waterloo Bridge, one of the main thoroughfares in London.
Which is an offence as an obstruction of the public highway.
Yeah, if you or I did that, we'd be arrested. But the police had their vans there, and the police officers were just chatting away to each other. And I saw so many of these Extinction Rebellion activities, demonstrations in central London, and always it was obvious that the police were on their side. And, if any motorist got agitated about what was going on and got out of his or her car, started remonstrating with these people blocking the road, then they were the ones that were risking arrest, not the people that are blocking the road. And this has become very topical now, isn't it? With all this talk about two-tier policing. And we have a two-tier society. We have people who are favoured by the regime and people who are not favoured by the regime. And if you're on the wrong side, then anything can happen to you. They are now wielding arbitrary totalitarian power. And the power of arbitrariness is such that you don't even know what you're allowed to do and what you're not. Because we like to think there's a line somewhere and you shouldn't cross that line, but we don't know where the lines are. And that's the way they want it, because arbitrary power is the kind of ultimate totalitarian power.
Well, you see some of the stuff they did with Tommy Robinson. I believe they went after him because he loaned money to his brother to put down a deposit on a house. And this is what every grandparent does for their grandchildren across the country. This is a usual thing that happens with millions of people. And I think they went after him for fraud, for lending his brother the money. Not his brother, of course. He was the one who signed saying, this is my money for the deposit. No, it's not just borrowed money, which everyone always signs that, even if they have been lent money by a family member. But they actually went after the journalist and political activist because he's not a member of the favoured class. Whether you agree or disagree with him, they went specifically after him on this completely arbitrary defence.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've met Tommy Robinson. I'm not really a fan of Tommy Robinson, to be honest, but I remember being horrified that day that he was outside the court in Leeds doing his job as a journalist, and he did quite a lot of training, and he spent some time with Rebel News, and he took it quite seriously, and he was, he'd learned stuff about what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, which is crucial if you're going to be practicing as a journalist. And there was nothing really that he did wrong that day, but he was whisked off the street and sent straight to prison. And of course, we've had a lot of journalists jailed, a lot of journalists persecuted in this country since then. Julian Assange being the classic case, but we've also had Richard Metcalf, I think it is, arrested at Heathrow Airport last week. What they're now doing with journalism, and, I see what you do as a form of journalism, and a very important form of journalism. I remember Resistance GB filming the protests against the COVID lockdown. And you and two or three others were the only people that were actually bringing this to public attention. You know, you were there live streaming, you and Tyrant Finder and Subject Access being the ones that I remember watching the most. And what they don't want is you and those other live streamers to be afforded the status of journalism. They'll say, where's your NUJ card? And NUJ is simply a trade union, right? Anyone really should be able to call themselves a journalist if they're practicing as a journalist.
Well, yeah, it's as simple as. But unfortunately, what the police do is they enforce membership of a private body illegally. So they say, unless you have this permit from one of the, and they literally call them gatekeepers for the UK PCA. And the UK PCA is purely a private organisation. Right? We could set up the GB PCA tomorrow. And have cards via that. We just issue our own cards from Resistance GB. If you're with Resistance GB, we order cards and say, here's the ID. That's exactly what they're doing. They're just a private organisation, just like we're a private organisation. They make their own cards, but the police will recognise them and they'll beat us up for not having those cards. And then if you join, so Sam, who set up Subject Access and was excellent, he actually joins the NUJ, I believe, got a card, and I think a few weeks later, they kicked him out. Heiko Koo, who was in the NUJ, set up one of the first independent newspapers in East Germany back in the day, was still writing for plenty of different outlets. They actually, not only did they cancel his card, but then they went and they spoke to the police and got the police to take his old card off of him, which is mad. So even if you join up, then they'll kick you out and they'll just whip your money. And also one of the things that they do is they say, I can't remember which clause it is, but it's throughout just about every single gatekeeper body, is they say, well, you can't publish anything that could potentially stir up hatred against a group. So, for example, if we happen to film I don't know, let's say a bunch of Muslims committing a lot of crimes. Well, that could then be construed as us promoting hatred against Muslims. Therefore, we would have to censor that, which would be ridiculous. We would actually have to censor our journalism because some individual watching the facts, watching the actual events that are occurring, the truth that we're meant to report, they could develop hatred. So they could have an opinion. And just because anyone could have an opinion. So it's completely an amorphous term. And so within our standards code, we completely prohibit membership of these organisations. But I'll tell you what's even more funny. When we wanted to go and cover the count in 2 different locations in the general election, Northwest Leicestershire, where Andrew Bridgen was running, and Clacton, where Nigel Farage was running, both of the counts just refused us because we didn't have these permits from these private, completely private organisations. We said, well, we've got our own permits. Why are we not considered to be equal? And it wasn't even a matter of, there's limited space, we'll prioritise the biggest outlets. You could understand that, although I'd say it's probably better to do some sort of lottery, but you could understand them doing that. And you could say, I disagree, but I'll let it go. However, they didn't do that. They'll bring in, tiny little, newspapers. They'll bring in, photographers who may not have very much work that actually goes anywhere, so long as they've got this permit. And they'll cut out us. I mean, when I streamed Farage in Clacton, I think we got something like 50,000 views. I mean, it's just off of Thai speaking, we got 50,000 off of that. We're not a tiny outlet. We're not a major one.
But you probably got more than 50,000. If it wasn't for the shadow banning, which we know goes on.
Yeah, we do face a lot of shadow banning.
And I think that what you're talking about is a sort of unofficial way in which organisations or institutions of society, including the police, were interpreting a situation. So it's, you and I know it's ludicrous that somebody should only be counted as a journalist if they're a member of the NUJ. But what's now happened with the Online Safety Act is that has institutionalized a difference between independent journalists, such as yourself, and approved mainstream journalists. Approved media are immune to many of the more draconian terms of the Online Safety Act.
Aha. But see, I know that we and UK Column actually have jumped through the hoops because I think they've snooked themselves. I think they've made a massive mistake here because there are only a few independent outlets who've actually really paid attention. I've read the Act a few times. I was reading the drafts back when it was the Online Harms Bill. They have snooked themselves because they couldn't find a definition of journalism that would suitably exclude people like us from journalism. So they put a bunch of arbitrary things. So they said, you've got to have multiple people. Okay, we've got multiple people. You've got to have an address. Well, I think that's a bit of a problem considering the fact that, you know, people can be attacked, you know, especially targeted if they're controversial people. People who may be completely anonymous have to put down some sort of address. That is a bit of a problem. But we do have an address. You need a standards code. We've got standards code. You need a complaints procedure. We've got a complaints procedure. And of course, you must practice journalism. So we practice journalism. So actually, this will be in the description of this YouTube video, are under the Online Safety Act a recognised news publisher. So this now remains to be tested. Will Ofcom enforce it? Is Ofcom actually going to be enforcing the fact that we are a recognised news publisher and so are exempt? And in fact, we should be exempt from all of the shadow banning. So we're very interested as to whether we can put forward a test case. Obviously, right now, we've got nowhere near the money. But if people were willing to get behind it, I think we've got a good avenue to be a test case and actually say, we meet this criteria. We've completely fulfilled the criteria. You cannot continue shadow banning us. You cannot continue throttling our videos. You cannot censor our videos because they're on certain topics. Because I think all of this sort of stemmed from the Talk Radio thing. When Talk Radio had a discussion and they got taken down and they got restored pretty soon afterwards. But this was an outrage, and it was the sort of the Tory crowd who started panicking because as much as it's all a uni-party, their faction of the uni-party was threatened.
Yes.
And they got scared because they thought, okay, well, they're going to seize all of the power for themselves. We can't let that happen. So they wanted some sort of protection in there. So if YouTube does try and strike down our videos, then it will be a court case because they cannot strike down our videos. And if we manage to be successful enough to have enough money to put together to actually start, you know, pursuing this in court, just for the shadow banning that we're still receiving, then we will be doing that and we will be making sure that everything is opened up. So in a way, it's a double-edged sword. For someone who doesn't look at the act, for someone who doesn't pay attention and jump through the hoops, because they're not actually that complicated to jump through. It's actually very easy. But for a single person, you go out, you film, you do journalism, okay, you don't have an address, or you might have a code of ethics, but you don't have a full complaints procedure. It's like, okay, well, send me an email. Okay, you probably need a bit more than that for them to consider it. If you do just do these basic things, it doesn't take long. Then we've got those protections. I would encourage any journalist out there, jump through these basic hoops. It's not much, and then we can club together because we will get these defences, or at least we can push to have these defences.
And the important thing is that misinformation or disinformation, which is what they're accusing, you know, non-kind of mainstream media of peddling, you may say everything that is right. You may couch it all in the right terms, tentatively, and you know, not make any claims that would go against their you know, ideas about what you should be allowed to say and their ideas about what constitutes misinformation or disinformation. But if you're interviewing someone like me, I could spout a whole load of misinformation and disinformation as the establishment sees it. And this is the point. It's not just about what you report, it's what you allow on your channel. And I wouldn't get anywhere near mainstream publishers with the likes of the talk I did today on the climate scam.
Well, look at even GB News, which is the most awake of the news channels out there. They had Rishi Sunak on. They had a Scottish gentleman, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. We interviewed him a short while back. He was injured by these jabs, who had a right go at him. They still said that this was favourable coverage and was biasing the election when he was ripping Sunak a new Arschloch. Excuse my German.
Yeah. So what they're obviously going to do now that they've passed this law is that they're going to start applying it.
Yep.
You know, there's going to be media channels, popular YouTube channels, which they're going to target. And what they will find is that a particular channel or YouTuber has interviewed someone who has spouted some misinformation, and that shouldn't be allowed. And it might not even be misinformation that the person running the channel agrees with. It might be, they might see it as a bit far-fetched or something like that.
They might completely disagree, but they've still allowed the person to express a view.
Yeah. That is the world that we now live in.
Yeah, we now inhabit.
So when I was worrying about my students in that they seem to have abandoned Enlightenment values of freedom of expression, democracy, and equality before the law, those students, as they grow up and they get into professional and managerial careers, and this is what's been going on for decades, is that we have a new establishment. I mean, Owen Jones, who's like, a Labour supporting socialist, he wrote a book 10 years ago or so about the establishment, but he was writing about the establishment as it was in the 1960s and 70s, really, and some lingering sort of remnants of it. The establishment, really, since at least the 1970s, at least going back as far as then, has been filled with graduates, a graduate class that's been brought up with these progressive, inverted commas, because I don't think it really is progressive at all, but progressive values. And they control everything now. The long march through the institutions is nearing its destination.
Well, it does seem they control just about everything. I mean, have you read Mark Sidwell's book? He wrote it in conjunction with the New Culture Forum.
Oh, yes, of course I have. Yes, yes, on the Long March. Yep. I did an interview with Mark after we brought out a book. A colleague and I, Robert Olds, wrote a book called Moralitis, and that was based on me moaning and grumbling and groaning to Robert about the stuff that my students would come out with, and he was on the outside looking in, and he could sort of analyze it better than me because I was just living it and not really seeing it
bigger picture
conceptually. And so, we came up with a notion of a cultural virus. And I think that is really how it works. It's like a virus which is produced and propagated and spread certainly among the university students, but really this has reached out everywhere now. We've had a graduate class that since the 1960s and 1970s has taken over our institutions. And now there is no institution that doesn't, at least in some way, show its adherence to cultural Marxist ideology. Whether it's some kind of sporting association or a line dancing association, everyone needs to show that they're in tune with progressive gender and racial, so critical theory, basically.
Do you know what I saw this morning? I was coming from Hastings this morning up here to Hope, and there was this, it looked like a tram. I walked up to one and said, what is this? And it's a trolley bus, apparently. It's like a sort of like a tour bus. And off the side of it were hanging the obvious nonce flags. I was thinking, even the old-fashioned 1950s trolley bus has now been incorporated It's probably a 70-year-old bus is
Which
now.
version of the Pride flag was it today then?
Oh, they had two, so they double bubbled. They had the old just pure rainbow, and then they had the one with the dysphoria and also the racism in it as well. So they went the whole hog.
So you had the original rainbow, of course. Then you had the arrow sort of bands for trans and for black and brown.
For the racism.
Yeah. And now they've filled in that space that's left over to the left of the arrows. They've coloured that yellow with a circle. And that circle, not many people know what that circle means.
Hermaphrodites.
Yeah, that circle is intersex. The cross for the female symbol or the sort of arrow for the male symbol, they've been cut off, leaving just a circle. And this has been an aim for a long time to get rid of the sex dichotomy. So when I was lecturing at university, I could still get away with saying to students that sex is binary, but you could have as many genders as you want, because gender is a social construct. I might disagree with all these constructs they come up with, but a social construct is as malleable as you want it to be. But sex is binary.
Gender is a linguistic term. So humans, and this is very important. We convey this to the kids because this is what they've tried to interpose upon humans, which doesn't function. It's a misapplication of the term.
That's right.
Words have gender because a word can't have sex, right? A word can't be male or female, but it can have masculine or feminine qualities about it. So they have gender. Humans don't have gender. I don't have gender. You don't have gender.
No.
We merely have a sex because we're not words.
Yeah,
I may surprise you, but we're whole people.
I don't live in a social construction where I consider myself to have a gender. I just have my sex. I'm male. But there are obviously lots of people that do believe in gender constructs. But I could still get away with saying that you can have all these genders, but sex is binary. Now, and this is what they're doing with this circle on the Pride Progress flag, is they are hitting at the binary nature of sex itself.
Which is a denial of science and denial of biology, basically, because I think I think it's only about 1 in 12,000 people or something like that is actually a hermaphrodite. I mean, you've got masculine women who have too much testosterone. You've got very feminine men who have too much estrogen, or it may be more complicated than that. Obviously, that's a very simplistic phrasing of it. There are different ways that a man could be less masculine, or a woman could be more masculine, etc. Actual hermaphrodites, it's only about 1 in 12,000 who have both sets of chromosomes, so 2 X and a Y.
But what they'll try and do is they are turning what's basically a genetic fault into a third sex. And they've been planning this for a long, long time. And as I spoke about during my talk here at the festival today, is green and woke are inextricable. People do not see them as the same thing. They see them as completely different entities. One is about saving the planet, being environmentally conscientious and decarbonizing everything.
So you mean slaving the planet?
Yes, yeah. And woke is about all this identity politics and favouring, or supporting minority groups, preventing discrimination. So people think, well, how are those two things linked? But they are both vehicles of an emerging technocracy. And for a technocracy to be created, they need to take full control of population and resources. And one of the best ways to control people is by divide and rule. This is an age-old tactic. And you see how the woke ideology, it seems to be getting more and more extreme. And that's deliberate because they want to keep upping the ante. They want to keep raising the tension. And sometimes you hear people say, oh, this will go too far. People won't stand for this or that. But look at the things that people are now accepting, now seeing as normal, that 10 years ago would have been seen as crazy.
They're happy to watch their children be nonced openly in the state schools
it keeps
with
going,
their money.
because revolutionaries don't stop. The revolution will keep going until it meets sufficient resistance. And this is our quest, isn't it, as critical thinkers who are awake to what's going on, to what they're trying to do with their dystopian agenda, is we've got to somehow wake as many people up around us as we can, because a lot of people seem to just think that life has gone back to normal since COVID.
Well, I mean, the people who are asleep, really. It's unfortunate because a lot of people will they came out to one march, or they sort of view everything as entertainment. So they'll be watching this and they'll view this as entertainment, but they won't do anything about it. Whereas I guess it's lovely being here at Hope, where you've got people who've actually come down and building networks, building communities, and making sure that kids are homeschooled and they're out of the system. Because do you think the state schools, and even sending your child, I know they're a bit older, off to university, do you think that's a form of child abuse?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as calling it child abuse, but there's no doubt to me. I mean, my girls all go to state schools, but there's no doubt that these are government indoctrination centres.
Why do you send them there?
Because they learn a lot of good stuff, useful stuff. Whether they could learn just as well in a good sort of homeschooling environment, I don't doubt that. I think that as a more general point in answering your question, I think there's a lot of things that we can and perhaps should be doing, and we don't do it because we live in a system. We live in a matrix, don't we? And it can feel a bit exasperating for people who... So take, for example, someone who takes the courageous course of stopping paying their council tax, right? On principle. I'm not just talking about somebody who thinks they should not pay their way in life. Somebody on principle is against paying council tax. And that person will have to deal with all kinds of challenges, bailiffs turning up at the door and that sort of thing. Most people don't want that hassle. And so the whole system is set up, really, so that people will go for what's convenient, comfortable, what doesn't get them into trouble, what doesn't raise their heads above a parapet. And I think that what people need to realize is that push is going to come to shove. This ratchet is going to keep tightening. And the question for everyone is, what are you prepared to do, and when are you prepared to do it? Because there's no doubt they're going to keep going with this agenda.
I think one of the tipping points for a lot of people, and one of the reasons that we've seen the riots that happened this summer, were because people no longer feel that their children are safe walking down the street. If you don't feel your daughter's safe walking down the street, if you know that the government has purposely created this scenario where your daughter is not safe, the government is causing your daughter to be in danger. If an attack happens against her, the government calls that. And it's just alarming to me when you see, with all of these, grooming gangs up in the north. What was it? They said 1,400, and there are thousands upon thousands more all across the country. It just is remarkable to me that the parents there aren't ready to fight a war. And it just, to me, it comes across as incredibly weak. And I think, I mean, this
Well, society has been emasculated, it's been atomized. People don't have the sense of community and of the power of their fellow men and women anymore. And I think that the message from those protests, riots, is very clear that if you even share something on Facebook, you could be arrested and put in prison. And I see what's going on since those protests after the Southport killings. I see it as three levels of people that we need to be confronting. So at the first level, the obvious level, is the perpetrators of these crimes. But we need to go beyond that and not just look at the perpetrators, because then you're just dealing with a symptom. We need to also look at the next level up, second level, which is facilitators. And I see that all this stuff that's going on with woke ideology, with green ideology, with the grooming gangs and the killings going on in around the country. Facilitators are the professional managerial class. They're the officers of the establishment. They're the ones that support all this woke ideology, green ideology. They're the ones that look particularly on the white working class, with contempt. They look at the Sun and Daily Mail readers, the sort of working class and lower middle class, with just such disdain that they would just anything that those people don't like is lovely for the comfortable, privileged, intellectual middle class. George Orwell, of course, was writing about this in Road to Wigan Pier. And then thirdly, the third level is the drivers. So your sort of middle class people who think that we should be welcoming refugees. So they include almost anyone coming over, however they get into the country, as a refugee, right? That's what we might call luxury beliefs, right? But it's not. They're facilitators in that they will give support to the regime, and they'll vote for politicians who apply this kind of ideology, right? But the top level here is the drivers. Who are the drivers? Who are the people that drive uncontrolled mass immigration, that drive green ideology and woke ideology? Who are the people that drive that? And that's where people have got to do a lot more thinking. And I'm not necessarily talking about the people here at the festival today, because many of these people are very awake to what's going on and who is creating these adverse conditions, this dystopian agenda. But largely, your vast majority of the population has got no idea really that there is an agenda here, and that woke and green and mass immigration are all instruments to get where they want to get.
So, in terms of them imposing it, may I ask who you believe is behind all of this agenda? Because obviously you've got a background as a lecturer on mental health. So, who's it behind this, and how are they manipulating people?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up my mental health background, because as a mental health practitioner and researcher, I learned and sometimes dealt with people that would be included in the bracket of what we call psychopaths. Yeah. And I think that one of the biggest problems that we have in trying to wake people up around us is that they think that people in power are the same as us. They think that they act and think in the same way that ordinary people do. And no, they don't. I mean, they wouldn't get where they are. I mean, someone like Justin Trudeau or Jacinda Ardern or Tony Blair or Tutia Keir, I mean, these people have been chosen groomed, if you like, to get into the positions that they're in, because they have certain traits. And I would say that there is a psychopathic element to their personality traits, so that they can brazenly lie to people while actually plotting people's impoverishment, enslavement, and even depopulation.
So it's psychopaths behind it. What percentage of the population do you believe are psychopaths, and what percentage of the population do you believe in terms of the elite?
Well, I think probably all politicians, if they're going to get anywhere, they have to have at least some of what you might call psychopathic traits. So I don't think it's necessarily black or white. You're either normal or a psychopath, but nothing in between. I think that politicians, you rarely see somebody who is absolute 100% psychopath, right? Even the most evil people that you can think of, they've also got some elements of humanity about them. Even look at Joseph Stalin, for example. In some ways he could come across as quite a fatherly figure, and he was adored by the Russian people, despite all the things that he did, despite the tens of millions of people that he killed. So it's about degrees of psychopathy. And I think that the people at the top, the people at the sort of apex of the pyramid of power, I think those people up the top will be pretty much full-blown psychopaths to do what they're doing. I mean, if you're plotting a massive cull of the global populace, they clearly want the population of the world to be drastically reduced. Some of these people at the top, they're not even hiding it. And to do that, to play some sort of angry god with people's lives like that, takes some amount of evil, doesn't it? What do you think about the people who are running the world today? Do you think that they're people who might be deluded, maybe a bit messianic, that they really think they're doing good for people?
I think that most people are bad people. I think most people live in their little bubble. They couldn't care less about what's happening on a grand scale unless it impacts them. Most people don't bother even raising their children properly. I know this from working in the state schools. They don't attempt to really pass their values on. They generally take the path of least resistance. And frankly, most people do absolutely nothing. You can see everything that's gone wrong in the last few years, and even before that. It's always a small minority of people who actually stand up and do the right thing, unless there's some great media campaign to marshal, and it suddenly becomes convenient and popular and trendy and, a big social thing, and it's really fun. That's why people end up actually going out and fighting for things.
Yeah.
So I have very little confidence in just about anyone, really. And it's sad, because I would like to believe that there's, a huge amount of inherent goodness in the human population. But like you say, it's always in degrees. I'm sure there can be, some of these people who are happy to continue to vote to perpetuate this system and vote in all of this evil and continue paying all of their taxes to support all of it and continue, cancelling people and shaming people. I'm sure they'll do a nice thing, like, you drop your, wallet in the street and they'll pick it up and give it to you. I'm sure they'll do something like that. But at the same time, they're the ones enabling you being thrown in a cell and your life being destroyed. So I couldn't care less. There's so much sociopathy, because sociopathy is defined as essentially this sort of psychopathic trait, but it's learned through social conditioning.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's most people. Most people are sociopathic. Most people don't think about right and wrong, because traditionally you go to church and you would focus on those different values. Like I'm not a Christian at all, but there's not even consideration of morals these days. The only consideration of morals is on TikTok and Facebook and whatnot, where they have these puritanical mob campaigns, and those aren't about actual morals. Those are just a way to show a sort of prudish, pearl-clutching snobbishness, as a way of saying, oh, I'm better than you because I can afford to have an electric car. I'm better than you because I can afford to pay to carbon offset and all of that absolute nonsense. I'm better than you because I've got a good job, but I believe in feminism, so I'm only going to hire women. So all the opportunities that I had as a man, I'm going to make sure no men in future can have those. And you've got all of these, ghastly boomers in Parliament who are just pulling up the ladder for men, because men are just
I think
lost so
you've
many
raised
opportunities.
a very important point there about sociopathy, because I would see that the people with the agency at the top, the sort of apex of the pyramid, they are psychopathic, I believe, in what they're doing. They're making decisions. They are individually responsible for wreaking their kind of dystopian agenda on the world. But what we have below them is a culture of sociopathy. And we saw that with COVID-19, and it was quite dark for us, wasn't it? Those who are critical thinkers, those who could see through the COVID scam, we saw these people that not only went along with the lockdown and the various measures, but enjoyed seeing people get into trouble. They enjoyed that they became snitches. We never had the internment camps in this country, but they did have them in Australia. And it was very disconcerting for the resistance movement in Australia to see that the large majority of the Australian public supported the idea of these camps. That if people were not going to do what they're supposed to do to go along with the COVID regime, then they should be incarcerated in these camps. And that certainly made me shudder. See that sociopathy in ordinary people. And I think that that's something that the psychopaths at the top, they use to their full advantage. They know that with these Southport protests and all these like people being sent to prison for some, a lot of these offences are very minor, if they're offences at all,
Coming to a town near you, meme.
shouting at a police dog, 2 years in prison. And sadly, there's a lot of people, and particularly in the sort of middle class, that, as I mentioned before, that professional, managerial, officer class, they enjoy seeing that. They love it.
Because it gets the people they hate, the class that they have
Yeah.
this hatred.
Yeah, and
towards.
as you say, a lot of it is pure snobbery. And this is what George Orwell was writing about back in the 1930s and 40s, because Orwell was a socialist, but he saw that the biggest problem for socialism is that it'd be the wrong people running it.
Orwell was a socialist, but I believe by the end he converted to liberalism. I think that he continued labelling himself as a socialist because he was, working to root out some of the harder left communist influences, and he was uniquely placed via his reputation and the socialist label to be able to root those people out. So I know that the left will always sort of try and claim him. Oh, he was a socialist. But if you look at what he wrote, 1984, it was about INGSOC. It was about the English Socialist Party. And I think what he realised was this was the inherent problem in socialism. What's really unfortunate
Animal
is,
Farm.
yeah, it's just unfortunate that he didn't, leave something behind to denounce it altogether. Although, who knows whether he actually did, and it was buried. You never know. But I think I'm going to judge the man by his writings. I'm going to judge him by his great works, and clearly they are the greatest enunciations of socialism you can come across. I mean, you see an evolution through time, as from the road to Wigan Pier, and his experiences during the Spanish Civil War. He realised, I believe. And it's just sad that so many other people don't realise, and so many other people. I just think with the kids at the moment, many people who believe in the freedom movement, etc., are older and they're saying, "Well, I believe in this, but my kids aren't on side." Well, how's that going to serve us in 50 years when you're dead and they're still around and they've raised your grandkids, your great grandkids through all of this indoctrination?
Yeah. Well, there's been a war on individualism. And this is one of the perhaps key attributes of Christian faith is that every person is special. Every person is unique. And other religions are not so keen on that idea. And certainly the political establishment of today isn't keen on individual freedom.
You talked earlier and you said we were going back to, essentially medieval times. Are we going into a sort of neo-feudalism, as you put it?
Yes, I believe so. I think that the two-tier society will actually be, for at least a while, it will be a three-tier society. So you'll have the people at the top, and then this officer class will still be needed for a while. So the police, the lawyers, the doctors, all the professionals that maintain the system. They couldn't have run COVID-19 without the full support of the medical establishment, could they? They couldn't have run it without the police and the judiciary. And there's an officer class that's needed to make sure that the what the elite want is what happens. Over time, though, that officer class will be less needed because of AI, because of technological advances. We're going to have RoboCop, aren't we? Within 10 years or so. There's already talk about replacing nurses and doctors with sort of AI robots. So that's kind of officer class will be less and less needed in future. Below them is the masses. And Yuval Noah Harari has made it quite clear what our status will be as ordinary people. If there's no jobs for us, and there won't be jobs because of automation and AI, that we will have the status of useless eaters. And we will be, the ordinary people, that is, will be very prone to all kinds of terrible prospects. I mean, I think that the obvious thing that they want to do, and they're not hiding it, is they want to have a pretty radical depopulation. But there will still be people at the lower level that are just needed for whatever, whether it's to fight wars or just for entertainment, Hunger Games, that sort of thing. There'll probably still always be the masses below, but they will be living in effectively a feudal system in the technocratic age. It'll be a much harsher, much more severe feudal system than was lived by agricultural laborers in the Middle Ages, who at least lived under the sun with nature and had some enjoyment in life, although it was hard.
Yeah, but also key rights, because there were certain rights that and obligations of the lord to the serf.
Yeah, yeah.
And often some serfs were better off than freemen. It would depend where you were. You were meant to be afforded protection by the lord, and you had a guarantee to be able to work the land.
Yeah.
And you only had to provide a certain portion of rent, or you had certain duties, and you kept everything beyond that.
But take the 15-minute city model, right? Now, The Guardian or the BBC don't tend to like to talk too much about these things. They'd rather people were, distracted onto other things. But if it ever is brought up, if, say, some reform politician makes some speech about 15-minute cities, then they'll feel the need to address this, and they'll say that this is a conspiracy theory. So even though the 15-minute city concept is there in all these documents from the World Economic Forum and so on, they'll say it's a conspiracy theory. They'll say that, just like they do about the Great Reset, right? They'll say that, yes, there is something that's put forward called the Great Reset, but it's not what the conspiracy theorists call it. And 15-minute cities, they say, all these far-right conspiracy theorists are trying to say that this is going to imprison people, when actually it's all about making sure that everyone has got all the services and amenities that they need within a 15-minute walk or cycle. What's not to like? And unfortunately, a lot of the educated middle class are suckers for this. When their cities are broken up into zones, with full sort of technological programming of your payment methods and monitoring of your movements.
Which is already happening in London with the ULEZ, because now you need to pay money to enter London. You need to pay, what's $12.50 a day to drive around your own city. And if you want to go into the centre of your capital city, right, on top of paying the ULEZ, you then have to pay a congestion charge, which obviously increases congestion.
These things are the thin end of the wedge. But this is how they use this thin end of the wedge, by acting gradually and through stealth. People just get used to the new normal, and then they let it settle for a while, and then they do the next thing.
So why are they so big on depopulation? Is it just a general misanthropic desire? Is there something about reducing the population to the 500 million target that will make humans easier to control? Or are they drinking their own Kool-Aid? Have they put this out in order to gain power, but they're sort of consuming it and going, actually, we need to do this because the world's going to end?
They talk about saving the planet, but what they really mean is saving the planet for themselves. So in the Industrial Revolution, you had this tremendous growth in the working class because all these people were needed to work in the factories. But you've always had that labouring class, haven't you? And they were needed. Society couldn't function without them. They did all the work. What we now have is a situation where the elite can see that they won't need anywhere near as many people to, be sort of servants of the regime. They'll still need some, but they won't need anywhere near as many. And from their perspective, the masses really will become useless eaters. And therefore, it makes sense not to have so many of these useless eaters. And the fewer useless eaters there are, the fewer people there are, the less risk there is to the power of those who are in charge. Because throughout human history, all leaders, no matter how much of an iron grip they might have had over their countries, they can see that there's a mass of people below. If they go too far, if they push them too far, then there could be a violent uprising. Well, I think that what the global elite are creating is a situation where an uprising will become almost impossible.
Is that what is needed, though? An uprising, a revolution?
Well, how do you stop these people who have wrested so much power over our lives? And we can talk all kinds of non-violent means of resisting and defying and do not complying to, thinking of Piers Corbyn's slogan there, civil disobedience. And I think that's important, that we try and live our lives as we think we should be living our lives. Yeah. And we do our best to delegitimize those who deign to rule over us. Humor, ridicule is always a good weapon, isn't it? But that's not going to be enough, I don't think. I don't think that's going to be enough. I don't have a very optimistic answer to your question, but you can never underestimate the potential for the elite to start fighting among each other. Because they're psychopaths.
They're psychopaths, but the thing is, their hatred of each other will never overwhelm their mutual hatred of us and the necessity of that alliance between them. I mean, when it comes to the tipping point, when they know everything's going to fall apart, when they know the ship is going down, then of course, they'll completely stab each other in the back. They'll start jumping ship as quickly as possible. First, it'll be a trickle, and there'll be an absolute flood of them because they'll all try. It's sort of early bird catches the worm, and the rest of them will starve. But until that point, there's no incentive. Look at what they've done to Andrew Bridgen. They've destroyed much of his life. He's still carrying on. He's still fighting. They've done that to him. Tommy Robinson's in exile. Piers has been beggared. Other people cancelled, censored. People put in prison. I've been framed, and they tried putting me in prison. Beaten up. They always have this interest, and until there's a genuine threat to them, until the bully understands that if they do pick on this kid, there is a decent chance that they're just going to get walloped straight in the face, then the incentives are all there. It's just economics. What maximizes their utility?
Well, we have as much as possible to create and maintain perhaps a parallel society, parallel social groups. So we can't, it's not realistic for all of us to, try and find some remote island somewhere in the world. We have to live in the system, or at least partly in the system. And I think that's where we should be. I think we should be not escaping, but we should be here and resisting, defying, and do not complying.
Until the time comes, and trying to bring as many numbers over to our side.
Yeah.
So when this clash does happen, we can hopefully win.
Yeah. Wow. Great.
Where can people find out more about you? Where can people go and buy your book and everything else?
So my book is called Green in Tooth and Claw, The Misanthropic Mission of Climate Alarm. So this book's available on Amazon. It's been doing really well, actually. But it certainly wouldn't get in Waterstones or W.H. Smith, and I certainly wouldn't get a review in mainstream media. But this is my 6th book. But I write regularly for websites such as Conservative Woman, Country Squire, all sounds very Tory, doesn't it? Unity News Network, and the Light newspaper. I write every month for them. So I'm not really a social media person, but I am on Gab, which is fairly non-censored, unlike most of the other social media are. But yeah, just look out for me on those websites. I also regularly go on TNT Radio, various presenter shows, and other live broadcasts. And it's been a pleasure to be talking to you for Resistance GB today.
Wow. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like, a share, a subscribe, hit the notification button if you would like to help. We've got a Patreon and a Subscribe Star, so please head on over there and pledge us some support if you want to keep this journalism going. We've got a professional studio here, and we could do with your support to keep these great conversations coming. Word association. Freedom. First word that comes into your head.
Resistance.
Tyranny.
The West.
Hope.
Festival. party.